Okay, in this video, our topic is animal rights. In brief, our position is that animals don't have rights. You may recall from the video on duty ethics that every right has a corresponding duty. That's justice. But not every duty has a corresponding right. And that's the situation with animals. We do have a duty to treat animals well, but animals don't have rights. So it's not a matter of justice, it's more a matter of practical reasonableness. John Finnis talks about the intermediate principles of natural law, the requirements of practical reasonableness. Practical reasonableness being one of the 7 basic goods for human action. So having practical reasonableness, that is, having prudence or practical wisdom, involves knowing how best to pursue human goods, that is, how to choose good means to attain these good ends, these basic human goods. And so up till now in the course, we've talked about number 7 on this list, how we need to respect in every act we perform, we need to respect every basic value, every basic good on this list. And we've talked about principle of double effect reasoning, making sure we never perform evil actions in the service of good ends. When it comes to animal rights, you learn from chapter 6 of your textbook, Charles Camosi's Resisting Throwaway Culture. You learn from chapter 6 on ecology and non-human animals just how badly animals are treated by humans today. In the United States alone, 10 billion animals are slaughtered in factory farming. And the simple fact is, when it comes to carbon emissions causing global warming, climate change, factory farming is responsible for 3 times the amount of carbon emissions than what's caused by all forms of transportation combined. So you take cars, airplanes, trucks, combine all that together. Well, slaughtering animals for food creates 3 times the amount of carbon emissions. So global warming, Camosi discusses, is caused by this consumerist culture mentality where we treat animals in this horrific way in order to have them for food. What does that require for moral practice? Well, it's immoral to eat food that was raised in factory farming because of the way animals were treated. We want to discuss those arguments in this video and in class. So we have to change our consumerist mindset and the way that we're doing things. And again, that's part of practical reasonableness. It's looking at how the planet is under threat from our practices of treating animals. So we'll return to these 10 items in other videos, but notice that the first 2 have to do with the coherent plan of life, a harmony of purposes. That is, you get to write the story of your own life and decide how you pursue the basic goods in a coherent way. And number 2 says you can't have any arbitrary preferences amongst values. You recognize that all of these human goods are basic human goods. So you can't say you're going to leave any one off the list. That would be contrary to practical reason. But notice that these are basic goods for human action. That raises the question of where do non-human animals fit into human pursuit of the good? We've got 2 arguments to consider in class today. One of them is concerning the moral status of animals from marginal cases. So even if you maintain that animals don't naturally have rights, as we argued at the outset of this video, they don't have rights because they don't know that they have rights and they're not free to choose to act differently. Even though animals don't have rights, they do have moral status. That is, we do have a duty to treat them well. And the structure of the argument goes something like this. We're just formally representing the argument this way, where minus stands for not, plus stands for it is the case that, minus also stands for if, and plus stands for then. So premise 1 says, if there's not a morally relevant difference between marginal humans, babies or elderly or anyone else we need to take care of and show respect for. If there's not a morally relevant difference between marginal humans and some non-human animals, then if marginal humans have moral status, if H, then some non-human animals have moral status too, plus A. So that's premise 1. And then premise 2 affirms, it is the case that, plus, it is the case that there is not a morally relevant difference between marginal humans and some non-human animals. So just as a baby needs to be cared for, so too our pets need to be cared for. So premise 2 says that that is true. Well, you see the conclusion follows. You see how it adds up. Conclusion 1 is if marginal humans have moral status, then some non-human animals have moral status too. And the genius of this argument is that it doesn't necessarily maintain that animals have rights. Even if animals have no natural rights, we have a duty to treat them well. So we could artificially create rights, just like when you buy a parking pass to a reserved parking space. We create your right to the parking space. So too, humans, in their duty to care for animals, can create matters of justice and law. And that's what this argument is working towards. Even if there are no animal rights, some non-human animals still have moral status, and we have to figure out what to do there. So premise 3 simply says it is the case, it is true that marginal humans have moral status, therefore some non-human animals have moral status too. That's the conclusion of the argument. You see that formal analysis says it's a valid argument. It's logical, it adds up. The question is, are all 3 of the premises true? We can discuss in class whether you think they're all true. If they're all true, then it's a sound argument and you must accept the conclusion. Using the same tool of analysis, we can also look at just the arguments chapter 70, which is an argument for vegetarianism. It comes in 7 premises with 5 conclusions. And the final conclusion, conclusion 5, says, if E, then W. If you're eating meat, then you're doing what is morally wrong. And it's quite a rigorous argument. We'll have to discuss, are each one of the 7 premises true? The first one says, if a being can suffer, then its interests merit moral consideration. So if a dog can suffer, then it's a moral issue. Even if the dog doesn't have rights, as humans do, then it's still a moral issue if the dog is being mistreated and suffering. Premise 2 says, if a being cannot suffer, then its interests do not merit moral consideration. So a table or a chair can't suffer, and it's not a moral issue if you knock over the table or you chop up the chair for firewood. So conclusion 1 and conclusion 2 just represent the identity there. Suffering, moral issue, that's what we're talking about. Premise 3 says that there's an equal consideration of interest principle that bears on this discussion, namely that the same interests merit the same moral consideration. That's premise 3. It affirms the truth. Plus, it is the case that this principle is so. Premise 4 says, if you cause a being to suffer without adequate justification, then you're violating that being's interests. Premise 5, if you're violating a being's interests, then you're doing what is morally wrong. So conclusion 3, you see adds up. It follows from premise 4 and premise 5, namely, if you cause a being to suffer without adequate justification, you're doing what is morally wrong. And then premise 6 says, if it is true that the equal consideration of interest principle holds, then if P, then C, where P is if you participate in killing, confining, or causing pain in order to use non-human animals as food, then you're causing a being to suffer without adequate justification. Now, premise 6 is what Camosi discusses in our textbook about how animals are mistreated. I said earlier before how factory farming is immoral because of the horrific way animals are treated. And premise 7 says, if you're eating meat, then you're participating in that system of factory farming. You may not be running the farm, but by wanting the lowest price for your meat, well, then you're a participant in that whole system of killing, confining, or causing pain in order to use non-human animals as food. Well, you see the argument adds up. Conclusion 4 follows from a combination of premises 3, 6, and 7. If you're eating meat, then you're causing those animals in factory farming to suffer without adequate justification. And that's why the conclusion, if you're eating meat, you're doing something morally wrong, follows. It seems that the only way to escape from the logical rigor of this argument is to find a situation where premise 7 is not true. Again, premise 7 says if you're eating meat, then you're participating in killing, confining, or causing pain in order to use non-human animals as food. As Camosy discusses in chapter 6, eating meat should be something done rarely, on special occasions. If you're eating meat, you should be able to look the animal in the eye that you're about to kill in a humane way, and then eat for food. It's a moral issue because of what's happening to the planet with climate change. 10%, the richest 10% of all humanity, as Camosy discusses, is causing 50% of global emissions. And 50% of the population is only causing 10% of those carbon emissions. So it becomes a problem of justice and equality. How you're related to other animals is not just an issue of so-called animal rights. We've argued that animals don't have rights. We do have a duty to treat them well. It's not just an issue of rights that we choose to give to an animal or duties that we realize we have to fulfill in relation to them. It's also a matter of justice in relation to all other human beings. Do only a few people on the planet get to live a lifestyle that, if everyone lived it, would make the planet unlivable? As a basic matter of justice, factory farming, food production, it's causing so much suffering of other human beings, suffering now and suffering to come from the effects of the climate emergency. So a lot to discuss in class. Maybe one way to focus our thoughts is to talk about this thought experiment called the indispensable serum. Suppose that several dangerously ill people can be saved only if we kill someone. They can't die first, they have to be alive. If we kill that person, then use their body to prepare the antidote. Well, we immediately feel that this violates human rights, and certainly on reflection we can conclude that, as long as we're not consequentialists. But what about animals? Animals being different from humans. They don't have rights, as I have argued, but we do have a moral duty to treat them well. And treating them well is treating them humanely. And we should think much more carefully about how we treat animals and how we're related to them.